I would like to give you the floor to Mr. Sachs from the NGO Monitor. He will present your report in a maximum of 20 minutes, I presume. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I understand this is a very busy time, especially with regards to budget, so I do appreciate your time, and I'm going to keep it brief and to the point. As the chair said, and thank you very much for the invitation, I represent NGO Monitor. We are an Israeli-based private organization that monitors the funding and activities of NGOs in our region, the Arab-Israel conflict. We maintain our independence both of the Israeli government, both financially and with regards to policy. We ensure that all our financial reports are available online to anybody, and all of our funding is only privately based. We do not receive any funding from any government, whether Israeli or outside. Our primary role, as is often said, is to follow the money. And until October 7th, we maintained a very strict policy of looking at human rights funding in our region to human rights organizations that are active in Israel, in the Palestinian Authority, and internationally, and deal with our region. Prior to October 7th, we looked at about 175 to 200 million euro a year just in the human rights field. That included about 9.5 million euro from the Dutch government. Direct funding to Israeli, Palestinian, and international NGOs just in the field of human rights. Following Hamas's brutal attack on October 7th, that number increased significantly with the desire of the Dutch government and many other Europeans to alleviate the suffering of those specifically in Gaza. So this number is accurate as to prior to October 7th and only deals with human rights. That is by way of introduction. Now let's get into what I want to present to the honourable members today. I need to start by speaking about Dutch policy. While I'm an Israeli, a proud Israeli, I often analyze the activities of the governments which fund NGOs in my country. The current Dutch government and its predecessors and its government before that, going back nearly 2 decades, has maintained that their policy is a two-state solution. And we can argue about what that means in practice, and it still doesn't answer questions of refugees, of Jerusalem, of all those other issues, and they desire and they require significant negotiation between Israelis and Palestinians. But the general framework exists for a two-state solution. This is prior to October 7th, and it was reiterated afterwards. Dutch policy supports a negotiated two-state solution. In addition, the Dutch government is very adamant about the fact that it wants to alleviate suffering and continue to be a role model in the area of human rights and development. And so I think it is appropriate that I'm here in this committee today not to criticize, but in actual fact to encourage Dutch development aid. But before I do that, I need to give you a few examples. So let's take a look at Dutch government funding to democracy and human rights, the cornerstone of Dutch development aid. Over the last 5 years, over 8.3 million euro has gone to a Palestinian organization called the Independent Commission for Human Rights. Another significant amount of money goes to the United Nations Development Fund. Both of these fund local and Israeli NGOs, Palestinian and Israeli NGOs. Following October 7th, the International Commission for Human Rights, a Palestinian-based NGO that receives significant funding from the Dutch government, put out the following. The ICHR strongly condemns the grave violations of human rights perpetuated by the Israeli occupation against the Palestinian civilians in Gaza. This is a letter sent on October 9th to a variety of international organizations, including governments, where, and I quote, the Independent Commission for Human Rights supports the Al-Aqsa floods of October 7th. There is no mention here of a two-state solution. There is no mention here of peace. There is no mention here of the right of Israel to exist. Yet this organization is receiving significant funding from the Dutch government to promote human rights, peace, and security. In addition, a number of organizations are funded from the Dutch government via the United Nations Development Programme. Here is just one example, Al-Mizan, which also receives significant funding via other organizations in the Netherlands. Al-Mizan regards occupied territory of 1948 as part of the settler colonial state of Israel. That doesn't leave much room for interpretation with regards to their view of a two-state solution. Prior to October 7th, Al-Mizan spoke about Israel using specially designed dams to flood Gaza. No dams of this kind exist anywhere in Israel, let alone with the ability to purposely flood Gaza. Yet Al-Mizan published this in their reports, and it became so outrageous that even Al Jazeera, not necessarily a pro-Israel media outlet, was forced to withdraw the story because it was so outrageous. Yet Al-Mizan continues to receive Dutch support for human rights and democracy. And what did Al-Mizan say following October 7th? Palestinian armed groups engaged in operation in response to Israeli aggression and crimes against the Palestinian people. This is on October 7th. As an Israeli, we were still picking up body pieces. Houses in Israel's south were still burning. And a Dutch-funded human rights organization spoke about armed groups engaging in a response. Unfortunately, this issue is getting worse. One of the pinnacles of Dutch ability and the fact that the Dutch government is regarded in such high regards with regards to its commitment to human rights, democracy, is transparency. Yet, over the last number of years, the level of transparency that the Dutch government displays has become dismal at best. And I say that with all due respect to the members of this committee, this esteemed government. The levels of transparency that the Dutch government is displaying have been squandered. This is a copy of a screenshot of a number of different projects that are funded by the Dutch government over the last few years. As you can see, the project remains ambiguous. Project in Palestinian-administered areas. Project in administrated areas. And we're talking about budgets of millions of euro. 3 million, 5 million, 16 million and above. On the website, this is a screenshot that I took last night, the website of the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, civil society organizations for inclusive democracy and human rights. This is a 9 million euro project. When we look into the documentation, as you can see here, this page comes up. Who are the NGOs receiving funding? How much do the NGOs get? What are they doing with the money? This is what the transparency page of the Dutch Foreign Ministry displays. Not a problem, I understand. This is another, well, depending on the year, it can go up to 17 million euro for reinforcing equal access to justice for Palestinians, a noble cause. No documentation exists on the Dutch government website with regards to who is receiving funding for this project. And so my colleagues at CD submitted a Freedom of Information request to the Foreign Ministry to find out who is actually receiving money for this project. This is the answer that was received. Implementing organizations have been censored to the public from a Freedom of Information request. So the question should then be, well, what are the risks involved in providing the information of the NGOs? And the Freedom of Information request provided this for the risks involved. And we were not asking for private information. We were asking for the names of the organizations involved. Who is receiving dozens of millions of euros from the Dutch government to implement a justice project? Now, why is this significant? Why is me as a private organization, why am I here today? And the answer goes back nearly 5 years to the Union of Agricultural Workers Committee, a Dutch-funded Palestinian organization that was involved in agricultural needs of the Palestinians. On October 7th, they spoke about a complete history change and the Great October Victory. 5 years ago, this organization was receiving almost 20 million euro for agricultural work in the Palestinian Authority. 2 of its members were involved in the murder of Rina Schnerb. They were receiving salaries from the Dutch government. Initially, the Dutch government denied this, but then an independent investigation paid for by the Dutch Foreign Ministry discovered that not only were these 2 individuals involved in the murder and were receiving their salaries from the Dutch government, but there were 20 other individuals who were also members of the Popular Front from the Liberation of Palestine, an EU-designated terrorist organization, who were also members and activists in the same UAWC, a Dutch-funded organization with dozens of PFLP members, terrorists. The result of this, appropriately, the government immediately stopped funding the organization. Credit to the government for realizing there was a problem. But the follow-up, as you saw previously, was from then onwards, the names of all the organizations receiving Dutch funding was censored from the public. And now, over a year after the tragedy of October 7th, when, yes, even I will admit, Gaza needs aid, but the aid is being stolen by, in the UN's words, unknown armed groups. As this committee knows, Dutch funding has expanded significantly to alleviate aid in Gaza. Yet there are no safeguards in place. If today dozens of aid trucks can be stolen, there is no ability that the Dutch have displayed to stop further aid being stolen. And hopefully, after the defeat of Hamas, when aid will need to return to Gaza and Gaza will need to be rebuilt, there needs to be significant oversight in where the money goes, how it is distributed, who receives the money. Yet, as of now, none of this appears to be in any of the activities funded or being achieved by the Dutch government. One more note I think is important to point out. According to the United Nations, the organization responsible for providing aid to Gaza, nearly a third of all aid, development aid and others, that is going to the Palestinian Authority is being used for advocacy. That means a third of all the money you are giving to Gaza for aid is being used to lobby you to give them more aid. This is according to the United Nations itself. One of the strategic goals is to maintain advocacy to continue lobbying for more money. And while it's very easy for me to be critical, I do come with concrete recommendations. We have a 12-point plan that you see in front of you. Primarily comes with regulations, which I will speak about in a minute, but transparency needs to be at the forefront of everything that is done. And as somebody who is a guest in this country, I can honestly say that the ideas of transparency should be the most obvious of all Dutch activities with regards to public funding. And until recently, as a researcher in an organization that deals with public funding, I would use the Dutch government's website as an example to others. However, over the last 5 years, I am ashamed to show the Dutch figures because there is no transparency. At the end, I think we can summarize much of what I've said into 2 points. I began by discussing Dutch foreign policy. Dutch foreign policy, regardless of where the honourable members sit, on the right or left or centre, is about a negotiated two-state solution. So let's use that. My suggestion to all of you, my recommendation to the honourable members of this committee, the denial of Israel's right to exist needs to be part of all contractual obligations to anyone receiving Dutch funding. That should be an obvious contractual clause. That means an organization can support human rights, but if they deny the right of Israel to exist, they are unworthy of receiving your taxpayers' hard-earned money. It's not about denying their right to free speech, but it's about maintaining Dutch integrity and policy. If you do not support Israel's right to exist, you are not in line with Dutch policy, you cannot receive Dutch funding, and that includes second and third and indirect funding. If the funding comes from the Netherlands to the United Nations, to other organizations, the funding still comes from the Netherlands. It needs to represent Dutch policy. And the second, based on experience, terror ties. The Netherlands is a member of the Honourable European Union. The European Union has a list of designated terrorist organizations that includes Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the Popular Front from the Liberation of Palestine and others. Organizations that receive Dutch funding, even indirectly, need to ensure that no members of their organization have any ties to European designated terrorist organizations. I very much appreciate your time. As I said, I would be brief, direct, and I would be very happy for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Sachs, for your contribution. We will now move to the questions from the committee members.
Voorzitter, punt van orde.
Yes, sir.
I'm going to leave now because I had a meeting with our 3 guests yesterday about the same presentation, and I have to go to the budget meeting of Foreign Affairs. That's not as disrespect, but because I have to go to another meeting.
Well, thank you for being here. Well, we'll move to the questions, and we'll start with 2 questions per member, and I will give the floor to Ms. van der Plas.
Thank you, and also thank you for your presentation, Mr. Sachs. It's quite shocking to learn about the fact that we obviously donate money to organizations which we have no clue about of who they are and what they are doing. And my first question would be, do you do this presentation also in other countries, and how do other countries in the European Union, how is it arranged? Do they donate also to these organizations? And is there transparency in other countries in the EU, or is the transparency the same as you stated, as in Holland?
Oh, I will give you the floor, and please press the button because otherwise the cameras don't work.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the question. Yes, we do present in similar forums to other European countries and at the European Union. Some countries are more transparent, others are far less. And even beyond the European Union, we also speak in the Norwegian Parliament, and a year ago I was at the Swiss Parliament. With regards to how do the countries respond, well, some countries, and I can give an example of the Swiss government, realized that they had a problem. In fact, some of the organizations they were supporting were significantly more problematic. And so, after an internal review done by the Swiss Foreign Ministry, a number of organizations were removed from receiving Swiss funding. The Danish government, a number of years ago, put in new clauses and criteria into their funding. So it varies from country to country, within the European Union, within the European continent, and the same goes for transparency. If I may, one other thing. Beyond looking at other countries, I think the Dutch should, in this case, lead by example. As I've shown, there appears to be a significant problem, and I think it would be appropriate that the Dutch address these issues so that in future speeches that I give, not only here but in other countries, I will be proud to say that the Dutch government has a leading role with regards to transparency and internal review.
Ms. Kammerga, for your
Thank you,
question.
Chair, and also thanks to our guests for giving this introduction and also for the report with the recommendations, because I think that's the important part. If we see things that go wrong, how can we address it and how can we move forward? And I had a question about the transparency point. I mean, you were saying that the last 5 years it became less transparent. I think we, as parliamentarians, always discuss with the minister about how can we be, how can we take more accountability or ask the government question. Because I was just wondering, maybe to make it more specific, is this only a problem in this regard or broader? Because for me as a parliamentarian, it's also difficult to get insight on which organizations we support, for example, in Sudan or in Yemen or in Afghanistan. For me, this is a broader problem that doesn't make it a less of a problem, but I was just wondering, how do you assess that? And the other thing is, we have some examples about direct funding from the Dutch government, but also some indirect funding. And we see that the UN, especially with regards to UNRWA, there was an investigation and there were 50 recommendations specifically on transparency. So they're making steps. I mean, you can discuss about whether or not it's enough, but they're all on transparency. Do you think that will help?
Mr. Sachs.
Thank you very much. So with regards to Dutch transparency, in general, I have compared the areas of the Palestinian territories on the Dutch transparency to other countries. There has been a lowering level of transparency in other regions, Afghanistan being one area, based on the ongoing issues and conflict there. The same also in Sudan. However, with regards to the amount of money and the number of projects, the Dutch funding to the Palestinian territories and the lack of transparency seems significantly higher than anywhere else. With regards to your second question, I think I need to make it very clear. Our organization deals with NGOs, and UNRWA, while a major problem, is not within our forte. But our recommendations are not to the NGOs. The recommendations are not even to the United Nations. My recommendations are to you, which is why I'm here today, because you are the elected representatives of the Dutch people, and the changes that we suggest should be made by you to your transparency, to the way you distribute funding.
Follow-up question from Ms. Kammerga.
Yeah, thank you for that, and thank you for the explanation. And I understand your position, but as you were saying, a lot of our money goes to the UN system, whether or not it's to the Palestinian territories or to other organizations. So I think, of course, we have to make our own house in order. But because a lot of money is going through the UN system, then our first line of defense is to see that their transparency rules are in place. So that's why I asked the question, but I understand that you cannot comment on that part, mainly on the Dutch and the NGO part.
Mr. Sachs.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you for clarifying. An important point about the United Nations would be that, firstly, their transparency is dismal at best. Secondly, when it comes to the real issue of terrorism, the United Nations doesn't have the same stringencies as the European Union. For example, the United Nations does not regard Hamas as a terrorist organization. They do not regard the Palestinian Islamic Jihad as a terrorist organization. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine is not regarded by the United Nations as a terrorist organization. So therefore, in theory, I'm not saying this is happening, but in theory, the Dutch government can give money to a United Nations body, and that body can then transfer the funding to an organization that is connected to or even associated with a Dutch designated terrorist organization, but the United Nations is upholding its own rules and ignoring Dutch rules. And there's no way to prevent that from happening right now, as far as I can tell. So that is the problem with the way the United Nations works, and with regards to saying that it is being slowly done right now, that doesn't appear to be good enough, with all due respect, to the values upheld by the Dutch government.
If you allow me, I will ask a question as well. Of course, transparency is not. We're not transparent now, so we don't know where the money is going, and we don't know if it supports organizations where terrorists are employed. Do you have any insight in which NGOs may be involved in terrorism and that are paid by the Dutch government, indirectly or directly via the European Union or the UN or the Netherlands? Mr. Sachs.
Thank you very much. With regards to which organizations are involved in terrorist activity, I need to explain that our organization only works with open source information. We will not rely on information that we cannot source from independent bodies, and that includes with regards to terrorism and the Israeli government. As of now, the Israeli government has designated at least 6 organizations that receive European government funding as affiliated to the PFLP terrorist organization. My suggestion is that the esteemed members of the committee speak to their colleagues in the Israeli parliament and Israeli security apparatus. They can shed more light onto this. My organization just deals with what we can publish on open source.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sachs. Do you have any other questions? Ms. van der Plas.
Thank you, Chair. How is City involved, or how does City help with tracking down organizations and what the organizations are doing, like not tracking them down to sue them or whatever, but how is this process going? Because you're telling me all kinds of things, and I believe this, but we also need to know how do those organizations work? How do they work? And how are you investigating this with City? And kind of a money flow. How do you know what money is going to what projects or what activities? Or
Mr. van der Vergeer, sorry.
Thank you for your question. Well, first of all, we are looking on information which we find by doing WO requests, so Wet Open Oversight. And we're also relying on investigations of other organizations like NGO Monitor. And we publicize information on our website as well, so you could follow us for this information.
And follow-up question, with the WO requests, you showed me a sheet in which was nothing, basically, a white sheet. And if you ask questions about that or do a new request, what is the answer of the Dutch ministry? Why are they giving you white sheets? Because you said earlier that you only want the name of the organization, so not people behind the organization, at least no names, but names of the organization. What is the answer you get from the ministry then?
Mr. Vergeer?
The answer of the minister will be, well, we need to defend the names. Publicizing the names of these organizations may harm these organizations. The principle of the minister is do no harm to other organizations. So that would probably be his answer, because he previously stated this when we started this vote request. I think that will be the same answer for this one.
Yes.
And if you would do a request for names of organizations who are funded in Holland, like, I don't know, NGOs who are fighting for nature or for, I don't know, windmills, or if you would do a request like this, and maybe you have done this already, to see if you get the names of those organizations, and then you can compare it to the, not getting the names from these organizations. Did you ever try this, or can you look up organizations of a whole other kind of organizations, like having nothing to do with Israel?
Mr. Sachs?
The answer is there's no need. Those organizations that receive Dutch funding here in the Netherlands have their names published. There's no need to submit a Freedom of Information request because it's already on the website.
Ms. Kammerga, do you have any questions?
Yeah, maybe. I think the parties who are sitting here are one of the parties who are in Parliament always critical on where our money goes to which organizations. And when we look at this conflict, I think all three of our parties have asked numerous of questions how we can make sure that the money goes to the people who need it and not to other organizations. For example, and I know you're not, we have the big debates about UNRWA, but also about other organizations. So I think that's a common fight, and then information, of course, helps on that. But for my party, it's still a struggle because we are concerned about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. So we want to get in humanitarian aid. And now we see that a lot of organizations where we have concerns, but they are almost the only ones who are equipped to give that humanitarian aid. So that brings a dilemma. So I was wondering, you raised some organizations where you have concerns. Could you also, and maybe you don't have to do it in this session, but maybe bilateral or otherwise, NGOs which are equipped to give that aid in Gaza and who are not affiliated with Hamas or other organizations?
Mr. Sachs?
Thank you. I need to make two important points. The first is, our organization looks at the funding and where the funding goes. Being a functioning democracy, just down the road, you have a very large Ministry of Foreign Affairs that is far better funded than my private organization and has far more staff. The role of finding appropriate recipients of Dutch funding should fall on your foreign ministry. And secondly, with regards to who is receiving funding at the moment and who is worthy of receiving funding, I think we need to take a very clear look at what has happened over the last decade. Just with regards to human rights funding, not before we even look at development, actual development aid and redistribution and building up Gaza. Over the last 10 years, the Dutch government has spent nearly 100 million euro on justice, democracy, human rights, all of these in Israel and the Palestinian Authority. Over the last decade, democracy, human rights, justice, freedoms have all gotten worse. And more troublingly, not only has it got worse for me and my neighbors in the Palestinian Authority, but as we saw 2 weeks ago, the troubles are now coming home to the Netherlands, where that same horrendous activity is being brought here. So it's no longer a question of do no harm. Harm is happening, and it is even coming now and harming Dutch Jews.
Do you have any follow-up questions? No. Then I have a question for you, Mr. Sachs. You have made a list of recommendations, and you stated two advice to implement. Can you elaborate on that and how those policies are implemented in other countries? I read about that Germany also implemented it, and the Swiss. But how do you can you say something about the process they went through, the discussions, and how that went, and how they implemented that?
So the process has been different, in my experience, in different countries, based on the debate, based on the democratic features of each country, which is unique. But what we've seen both in Switzerland, in Denmark, and other places, is additional language to contracts of NGO recipients. So, for example, the contractual obligations of an NGO includes budget. They need to be open with their budget, submit list of activities, submit regular reports. They also need to commit to non-violence. In certain countries, there is also a clause. So, for example, the Dutch could demand that all NGO recipients sign a clause that says they agree with Dutch foreign policy, and that includes the right of Israel to exist. Some type of language of that kind could be implemented here, and it is just a contract. It is part of the contractual obligation. The same could be said, and has happened in other countries, with regards to the anti-terror clause. A NGO recipient is aware that the European Union has a list of terrorist organizations. They sign a contractual obligation to say nobody receiving funding from the Dutch project is associated with or a member of designated terrorist organizations. That is the way it has been implemented in certain countries. That is the way it is also being able to be enforced by other countries.
I have a follow-up question. Of course, I think you monitor what the effects are of these policies. Do you see any changes in the policy of the recipients of subsidies or money in Germany or in Swiss? Mr. Sachs.
No. We have not seen any changes in the activities of the NGOs that have had their funding suspended. Quite the opposite. The NGOs become very aggressive and attack their previous funders. In many cases, my organization, we are dubbed as right-wing, as extremist, because we demand transparency and accountability. And the organizations continue, in some cases, with their violent rhetoric and with their public support of the activities of October 7th.
Yeah, sure. Ms. van der Plas, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Could you or CD provide a list of countries and their rules and regulations on funding organizations like these?
Mr. Sachs?
I would be very happy to provide it, but in the report that I provided with you, we have a list of best practices from countries around the world. That includes the US, the European Union, and other countries that can all be seen as regards to how to implement appropriate policies. It's important for me to point out, while I have been very critical, other countries, including the Netherlands, there are many, many things that can be learned from each other and exchanged in order to make everyone's situation better.
Thanks so much. I will read the report. I didn't have the chance, of course, to read it yet, but I will look into it. And if I have further questions, I can turn to CD or ask you for more answers to my questions. Thank you so much for explaining everything. Thanks.
And I believe also that on your website there are links to NGO to the NGOs, and the list, yeah, they are also provided there. That's correct, right? Yes. Okay. Are there any other questions from the members? No. Well, Mr. Sachs and the members of the CD, I want to thank you for coming here and for your contribution. I will now close this session, and I wish everybody a good day. Thank you very much.